material and to live, work, and learn on this land. We not only recognize our connections with Indigenous people, but we commit to maintain respectful and mutually beneficial relationships with these communities in order to honor and celebrate their past, present, and their future. Also, the New Mexico Archeological Council would like to respectfully acknowledge our debt to the enslaved people, that much of what we know of this country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development throughout history and across time, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved peoples, primarily Africans and their ascendants, who suffered the horror of the transatlantic trafficking of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. We are indebted to their labor and their sacrifice, and we must acknowledge the tremors of that violence throughout the generations and the resulting impact that can still be felt and witnessed today. I would like to thank all of the NUMAC board members and committee chairs who volunteered time this past year. This year has flown by, and we have shared lots of ideas. To date, we have held 3 quarterly meetings in 2022. We've put out a newsletter. We've provided input on the Chaco Cultural National Historical Park area land withdrawal, managed membership grants, discussed plans for future workshops and conferences, and kept the council's finances in the positive, all while continuing to return back to our pre-pandemic times. It has been so nice to gradually return to pre-pandemic times, all the while utilizing our abilities to remotely communicate and meet with each other. We will solicit in the future, probably in the next couple of months, for several open vacancies that we have here in NUMAC, but I urge all of you to consider volunteering your time next year. If you have any interest in joining the board or the committee, please reach out. Next. So it is customary at the fall conference each year that we present one individual with the Distinguished Archaeologist Award. The Distinguished Archaeologist Award has been presented annually for well over a decade now, and it honors a member of the New Mexico archaeological community who exemplifies the goals and supports the purpose of NUMAC, including promoting scholarly research, promoting public awareness of New Mexico's heritage and the need to protect our cultural resources, encouraging professional standards of ethics appropriate for the management of cultural resources, and promoting the education of archaeologists in cultural resource management. I would like to think that all of us in this room have been lucky enough to have crossed paths with Michael Marshall, at some point in our careers. His breadth of knowledge in Southwest prehistory and history, and his constant passion to understand and research has made him our recipient for the NUMAC 2022 Distinguished Archaeology Award. Mike once said, "The land is a stage with a multiplicity of scenes upon which is enacted the history of humankind. In New Mexico, the backdrop might be a frigid mountain, stream fringed by pines, or a dune-draped desert basin with the nearest spring 30 miles distant. The actors cross the stage and exit, making way for the next scene or an altogether new performance." This is a brilliant way of describing New Mexico and an understanding how people and culture interact with the landscape. The landscape here are so vast, and the something changed on the computer, I'm sorry. And the topographic features differ from the east to the west, and the river valleys remain constant. Mike grew up in Colorado and spent many summers in Cripple Creek, which he explained opened the door for exploration and wander. Mike's wandering and interest as a child allowed for him, as he got older and further into an archaeology career, the ability to traverse throughout the state and explore and learn. He has investigated the archaeology of the Piro and Southern Tiwa cultural areas, the Alamo Navajo, the Chaco District, the Santiago Pueblo, Isleta Pueblo, and Pottery Mound. He has been recognized by the state of New Mexico with a Heritage Preservation Award for his identification and documentation of archaeological properties in New Mexico. I have personally had the pleasure of being in the field with Mike. Listening to him teach and share his archaeological knowledge has been a great memory of mine. Mike is highly deserving of this honor. Unfortunately, Mike could not be with us here today due to scheduled travel that he had. We will present Mike with the award upon his return and hopefully get him to smile for a picture with us. We will post the picture on the NUMAC website, so please join me with the well-deserved round of applause for Mike. Here's the award that Mike will be receiving that we will be sending to him. And next I'd like to introduce Dave Phillips. He will be presenting the Lou Schuyler Award.
Can you hear me okay? This morning we're remembering one remarkable woman and honoring another. Lou Schuyler was a Maxwell Museum volunteer who turned field notes and collections into descriptive reports on multiple sites, most notably to Harris Pueblo. The award in her memory honors similar efforts to publish reports on legacy projects. Each recipient will receive a plaque and a cash award for $250. So more than pennies from heaven on this one. Many people deserve such an award, and I'm looking at a few of them right now, and we will honor them in future years. Meanwhile, it's very appropriate that the first recipient of the Schuyler Award is Joan Mathian. So. From 1971 to 1986, the National Park Service and the University of New Mexico conducted a program of fieldwork and analysis focused on Chaco Canyon. Unsurprisingly, 15 years of continuous research created an enormous backlog of reports. We are very fortunate that Joan Mathian stepped into the breach, both as an editor and as an author. Joan retired from the Park Service in 2005, but that didn't stop her efforts to document the history of Chaco research, not just by the Park Service, but by everyone, and the findings of those projects. Her enormous output over the years is not just highly important, but inspiring. Please join me in again thanking Joan for all her efforts.
Say thank you to NUMAC, but I also want to say thank you to Lou. I remember when she first came here and volunteered, and she said she was going to look at the jewelry from Pottery Mound, and could I help her because I had looked at the jewelry from Chaco. So it was a real honor to see her grow and become the important contributor to the archaeology of New Mexico that she was. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. With that being said, I would like for us to take just 30 seconds, a minute, to all of us just remember everybody that we've lost in this field of study and practice. We've lost a tremendous amount in the last several years. So if we all just want to take just a few moments to just kind of keep them in our memory and remember them and their families. So please. Thank you. Okay, something. I'd like to thank all of our presenters who made it here today for sharing their hard work with us. I am looking forward to hearing all of our presentations. With that, I am happy to turn this over to our conference organizer for this year, Megan Trowbridge. It likes itself out.
Okay. Uh-oh. What's going on here? Oh boy. Sorry guys, 1 second.
That's when it changed slides to Skylar on its own. What's going on? I don't know. It says it's a network issue.
It's not on the network.
I don't know.
Okay.
Is it the mouse?
Maybe. I have an external mouse in my bag. Let me grab my mouse.
Okay. Here. I got it. It's doing something.
Oh,
Yeah. Like it switched on its own and went to Skylar and then it just froze there.
okay. Well, we'll just leave that up for a second.
Okay.
And then we'll do the rest. Okay. Christina and I did not intentionally match today. Thank you, Christina. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming, joining us today, and for viewing for viewing the live stream for those that are joining us online. I want to give a quick thank you and shout out to Bo Whitehead and Pat Lagodny. They have been setting up all of our live stream events, all of our technological things for the keynote last night, also for today. They've just been immensely helpful in getting this conference running logistically today, so thank you both to them. Also thanks to Christina for her help with coordinating logistics and details for today. So earlier this year, at the beginning of February 2022, Dave Phillips actually sent an email out to the NUMAC email listserv and made an inquiry about Black History Month and archaeology pertaining to Black history in New Mexico. That then set off a long string of emails. Maybe a lot of you might remember this on the listserv, that started a long string with membership from NUMAC responding to the emails related to providing information about archaeological sites related to Black communities, historical resources and research that have been done about these groups across New Mexico. It was pretty quickly clear that there has been archaeological and historical research on African American groups in New Mexico, but those studies are not very numerous and they're not necessarily well known or synthesized. So this was the basis for our decision to choose the theme for this year's conference, and we decided to widen the scope of that theme to include any interpretation of underrepresented groups. So thanks to Dave for starting that conversation and planting the seed. The term underrepresented is not a reflection of the actual presence or absence of certain groups in the state of New Mexico necessarily. The term is being used here to reference the underrepresentation of certain groups in the historical and archaeological records of the state. In some cases, it's even used to reference certain underrepresented and or underrecognized folks within our archaeological community. This is a recognition of the fact that we as archaeologists and historians have perhaps disproportionately focused our attention and research interests on certain populations. One example I'll provide, in the NMCRIS system, we are presented with a list of options for cultural affiliations for which to associate archaeological sites. If you look through that list, you will find no option for African American or Black affiliation, nor affiliations of Asian descent. You will, however, be able to select extraterrestrial alien. So, just throwing that out there. To those of you presenting today, I'd like to say thanks for joining us and for sharing your research. A number of our presenters and surely some of our attendees as well have traveled from outside of Albuquerque to be with us, so we're happy to have everyone here. While the papers in today's agenda have ended up being predominantly focused on African American history in New Mexico, we will begin with a few papers related to other underrepresented groups in New Mexico history, as well as underrepresented groups in the field of archaeology. So kicking things off, our first speaker is Emily Brown. And they'll come get us started. number 1. Okay. And you can just use the arrows or the space bar.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Megan, and good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? All right. So this presentation is adapted from one that Rory Gauthier and I put together for the Santa Fe Site Stewards, and then an article that we subsequently published in 2016 in the Archeological Society of New Mexico annual volume in honor of David Snow. And I'm very sorry that Rory can't join us today. His health just won't permit it. He knows way more about the subject than I, so I'll do my best to answer questions later, but really I'm presenting mostly his research. So the 18th and 19th centuries in New Mexico were tumultuous, and relationships between the Pueblos, the Spanish, and nomadic tribal groups were constantly changing. And communities and ethnic groups were factionalized, alliances shifted, and everyone was in competition for the region's scarce natural resources. And so it's perhaps no surprise then that a different resource in the form of human labor came into play, and that trading and raiding became entangled. And some of the most exploited and marginalized people are the so-called Genízaros. And the complex ways in which genes and culture intertwine to form identity is much too large a subject to address here. So I'll present a very simplified discussion of what Genízaros are and the status that they had in Spanish colonial society. And then I'll describe 2 Genízaro sites, one in La Cañada on the Rio Chiquito, north of the Pueblo de Cochiti, and another on the Abiquiu land grant. Archaeologists have found plaza sites and ranchos at Genízaro settlements, and one of the questions Rory and I looked at was the relationship between the 2 types of sites and whether one preceded the other. So the Spanish word Genízaro has generally 2 meanings, and it was also used as an ethnic term identifying Spaniards with foreign European blood. And the term is thought to have its origin in the Turkish word Janissary or Yanicheri. In English, that became Janissary. In Spanish, the Genízaros. And the Janissaries were Christian, Balkan-born elite military units that were used by the Ottoman rulers. So its origin dates back to the Old World, or goes back to the Old World. And in colonial New Mexico, both the foreign and the military meanings were connoted by the term. Genízaros were Indian captives, often women and children, but sometimes men, taken in raids by Spaniards or by other Indians. They were usually Kiowa, Pawnee, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Navajo, and Crow Indians. So in the Spanish view, they were subjects of the crown, but they were foreign blood, so that meaning continued. And we'll get to the military part of this in a minute. So to be clear, even prior to the arrival of the Spanish, Pueblo people traded and warred with Plains groups, with the taking of captives, strategic marriages, and fictive kin relationships all playing a role. On the Spanish side, the people who financed and participated in the expeditions to explore and settle Nuevo Mexico had done so with the promise that they would obtain great riches. When the 7 cities of gold turned out to be a myth and the land itself proved poor in mineral and other resources, administrators and church officials alike turned to unpaid human labor to recoup their investment. So this image is of the Mission Church built with the indigenous labor at Pecos Pueblo, the site of a long-running trade fair. And we know that one of the Spanish governors issued permits authorizing the seizure of Indian children at such fairs in the 1680s. I'm sorry, the 1530s. 1630s, there it is, can't read. The Franciscans also took captives, cloaking it as redeeming heathen souls out of Christian charity. And when such kidnappings failed to meet the demand for unpaid labor, they took to raiding the Apaches and other groups. Spanish soldiers and missionaries alike captured and sold slaves who were sent to work in the mines of northern New Spain. And one of the factors inciting the Pueblos to revolt against the Spanish in 1680 was their ill treatment of their Apache trading partners. And Spanish raids against the Apache are one reason some Apache also participated in the revolt. But the Pueblos also worked independently or with the Spanish to take Navajo and Ute captives. And of course, the Navajos retaliated by taking Pueblo and Spanish captives. But alliances were always shifting, and in the 18th century, Navajos were full-fledged suppliers of captives to the Spanish. There are even records indicating that in 1699, Navajo raiders returned from an expedition with 2 French girls, and they were christened Marie and Antonia, but we know nothing more about their origin or their fate. So while slave trading was technically forbidden by Spanish law, including a reiteration of the ban on buying and selling Indian slaves in 1681, human trafficking at trade fairs at Pecos and Taos continued following the Reconquest in 1692. And Indian captives were sold at these fairs, usually to Spaniards who would then have them baptized and use them as unpaid household servants. And transactions involving human beings were rationalized as rescues that saved the victims both from a life of savagery and eternal damnation, an artifice known as rescate. In theory, the ransomed individuals were freed upon adulthood, but terms of service were vague, and this was not always the case. And in addition to the Spaniards, slaves were also held by Pueblo peoples and other Genízaros. In 1776, Fray Atanasio Dominguez reported that the going rate for an Indian girl 12 to 20 years old was 2 good horses and some trifles, and for a boy of the same age, a she-mule or 1 horse and a poor bridle, a price that held steady up until the mid-19th century. Girls brought more because they were good housekeepers and were frequently used as sex slaves. And researchers who have looked at parochial registers dating from 1700 to 1880 say that some 5,000 Plains and pastoral Indians entered New Mexican society as indios de rescate during that 180-year period. So to be clear, the taking of captives and holding of slaves went both ways. The drawing at the upper left is an 1845 image of a Spanish girl captured by the Comanche man Little Mountain and given to his father as a gift wife. Another Comanche captive was Jesus Sanchez, sketched by George Catlin in 1834. The image at the bottom is of a Spanish boy named Santiago McKin, who was captured by the Apaches. So early on, Pueblo people at the trade fair host sites were middlemen, purchasing slaves from their Apache allies and then selling them to their Spanish customers. Some captives became fully acculturated and incorporated into the society of their captors. A few became bilingual and moved fluidly between their culture of origin and their adopted one. There are tales of Spanish women who were ransomed and returned to Spanish society, but they died as spinsters because they were ostracized. In contrast, there's the story of a Pueblo woman who was captured by the Navajo, but ultimately returned to the Rio Grande, wed several times, bore 7 children, and at the time of her passing owns 2 ranchos and was rich in livestock. Within Spanish society, the experience of captives varied on a continuum ranging from near slavery to incorporation into the family, but with few people viewed as more than servants. So one of the first written uses of the term Genízaro in colonial New Mexico dates to the late 1600s. In truth, Genízaro is one of many ethnic designations in a system of castas that had evolved by the mid-17th century. Originating out of a system that distinguished Spanish Catholics from Muslims, as well as Jews, to define Spaniards from Spain, Indians, Criollos, which were Spaniards born in the New World, and mestizos, the products of the inevitable Indian-Spaniard unions. And eventually administrators, friars, and the other writers created systems of from 14 to 20 categories, and graphic representations of sets of castas actually became a popular genre of painting during the 18th century in Spain and Spanish America. In reality, the categories of castas varied widely from writer to writer, and in practice, tracking individuals and their ancestry was never accurate. In some cases, reference to a simple form of Spanish spoken in a community is one of the only clues to the identity of its Genízaro occupants. The thing to take from this is that a person's blood lineage was thought to be indicative of his or her qualities and attributes, with casta people thought to be illegitimate, of impure blood, criminal, poor, suited for manual labor, and of low status, in contrast to the Spaniards, who were viewed as legitimate, pure of blood, honorable, law-abiding, wealthy, and noble. Fray Dominguez wrote in 1776 that Genízaros were servants among our people, unable to speak Spanish without twisting it somewhat, whose weak characters turn them into gamblers, liars, cheats, and petty thieves. So in colonial New Mexico society, Genízaros were of very low social status and were quite poor, as this census of the province of New Mexico from 1757 to 1758 indicates. Beginning in 1759, the Spanish monarchy became more concerned with solidifying the borders of its territory, revitalizing its claim to the land and increasing settlement. In the early 1700s was the same period in which the Comanche moved into the eastern plains, becoming fully equestrian within a few decades and pressuring the local Apache populations. Spanish requirements for tribute meant that surplus agricultural products from the pueblos went to them instead of being available to trade with plains groups in the traditional way. So plains nomads took to raiding to obtain the corn and other goods and tended to steal horses rather than raise them. In his book Comanche Empire, Hamalainen argues that for a long time the Comanches were a more powerful force in the region than the Spaniards, tolerating the Europeans' presence in New Mexico only because they were a source of horses and other goods. Concerned with the ongoing and devastating depredations by Comanches, Apaches, Navajos, and Utes, Spanish authorities thought to establish buffer communities of soldiers, landless settlers, and Genízaros. Once released from service by the family that purchased them, adult Genízaro men were landless, and joining the militia was one way they could improve their fortunes. With their knowledge of the landscape and culture of the region, they were crucial in defense of the province, playing key roles as scouts and auxiliary units, and it is here that we get the military connotation of the term Genízaro. So the Spanish sought to position Genízaros on the margins of the territory, giving them community land grants on the edges of the Spanish frontier. Despite the risks, Genízaros often settled in these areas because it meant they would have access to land they never would otherwise. Also, such settlements were not necessarily composed of all Genízaros. Often there was a mix of Genízaros, Españoles, and other casta categories. As an example, the settlement of San Jose de las Huertas, east of Bernalillo, increased from 8 Genízaro families to 21 Spanish and Genízaro families, with much intermarriage with Indians from San Felipe, Santa Ana, and Sandia. So alliances at these outposts were negotiated at the local level, however much Spanish administrators may have wished to maintain ethnic differences and political distinctions. So here's some of the Genízaro settlements from the 17th century through the 19th century. And one of the important things to take away from this is that the pattern of settlements is closely related to that 1759 law and impetus to settle the perimeter of the territory, and also that the pattern of settlement is closely related to the increase in raids on Spanish communities by the various native groups in the second half of the 18th century. The very first Genízaro settlement was part of Santa Fe, known as the Barrio de Analco, and that was settled by Mexican Indians who traveled north with the Spanish. And they've long been assumed to have been Tlaxcalans, but recent research indicates they may also, or instead, be Mexica or Nahuas. Regardless, we do know that most of the Mexican Indians brought to New Mexico early in the colonial period were servants and laborers and even slaves. And most of the other Genízaro settlements were established on land grants, however. And the second thing about this list to note is that they continued to be established, if much more intermittently, into the 19th century, with Anton Chico being granted by the Mexican rather than the Spanish government. So I want to turn now to the archaeological evidence at 2 Genízaro settlements, one in the Cañada de Cochiti and the other on the Abiquiu land grant. La Cañada is located along the Rio Chiquito, approximately 10 miles north of the Pueblo de Cochiti, and the earliest reference to the settlement is from 1728, when the area was granted to Antonio Lucero. And following a visit to the community in 1776, Fray Dominguez described it as a settlement of ranchos throughout the canyon. And the word rancho should not be confused with the modern idea of a ranch. As used by Dominguez, it's really a simple hut or a group of huts located away from a larger settlement. And his description is also important because it mentions that the area is marginal for agriculture, suggesting that it was a settlement of lower class citizenry. And he also mentions that the settlers speak the usual Spanish, the euphemism he reserved for the lower classes of mixed ancestry, usually Genízaro populations. And the ranchos along the Rio Chiquito and La Cañada de Cochiti range from single-room structures to those containing up to 10 or more rooms. This is a 2-room example. And most were built of locally available materials, such as this one of local stone. Some of them have a placita incorporated into the building to contain livestock, a type of structure referred to as a casa corral or casa corrales. Small settlements consisting of a group of loosely associated ranchos and often located near or possibly associated with a defensible plaza structure are referred to as a población. The distribution of ranchos along the Rio Chiquito forms a classic example of a población and included numerous ranchos, agricultural fields, and an acequia. You guys can read the legend. The little dots are the ranchos, the squares are the plazas, and the blue lines are the Rio Chiquito and the acequias. So you'll note that all the rancho sites are immediately adjacent to the floodplain and have access to water either from the Rio Chiquito or the acequia. And the plaza as an architectural form consists of blocks of rooms surrounding an expansive communal area. Spanish laws required settlers to form defendable plaza-type settlements, but they were rarely followed as New Mexico's difficult terrain, lack of water, and poor soils made it necessary for each household to have access to more land than this model permitted. Spanish settlements in colonial New Mexico were characterized by a lack of planning and were small and dispersed until the latter half of the 1700s, when the need for defense finally forced them to coalesce into larger, defensible structures consisting of consolidated houses with no exterior doorways and plaza entrances that could be secured. So missing from Dominguez's report on La Cañada is any mention of plaza settlements or a church, but there are 2 examples of plazas in the La Cañada area. LA 3445, known as the village of La Cañada, and LA 9846, Plaza Fuerte. And this is Plaza Fuerte. Ceramic evidence from both sites indicate that a date range of 1700 to the mid-1800s, and they're the largest structures in the area, with Plaza Fuerte measuring 100 feet on the side and La Cañada even larger, with a church located in the plaza. It's possible that these 2 plaza sites were established sometime after Dominguez's visit, perhaps coinciding with an increase in Navajo raids beginning in the late 1700s and early 1800s, which led to repeated hiatuses in occupation and the departure of the inhabitants of the community in 1835. Many settlements were established along the Rio Chama in the mid-18th century. Plagued by raids by bands of Ute, Navajo, and Comanche from the beginning, people left all of them, including the plaza of Abiquiu in the mid-1700s, and moved to Santa Cruz de la Cañada. It took many years for the inhabitants to return, and it was during this time that a number of Genízaros established settlements at the edge of the northern frontier to serve as buffers to other communities downstream on the Rio Chama. Several of these are found on the high mesas near the Genízaro settlement of Abiquiu, shown here in a photograph from between 1880 and 1885, thought to have been taken by Adolphe Bandelier. One example is a plaza at LA 188019 that Rory Gauthier and I recorded in 2015. Built of adobe, it measures 60 meters on its side and encloses a plaza with a single entrance on its south side. The associated artifacts included pottery and large amounts of faunal materials, along with a faceted blue glass trade bead and a gun flint. The pottery consisted mainly of trade wares from Tewa villages and several types of micaceous wares, along with smudged gray or black wares that may be of local manufacture. Together they indicate a period of occupation from 1700 or 1750 to 1850 or so. And there's an acequia immediately to the west and south of the plaza, and Vallecitos Creek is 285 meters to the southeast. My crew and I went back and recorded more of the site in 2017 and found evidence of various small stone structures on a prominent hill west of the plaza. If the area was less heavily treed, it would have provided a good vantage point from which to view people approaching from the west. And these structures are far from water and arable lands, suggesting they are not ranchos, but were likely related to defense. Much more survey on the Abiquiu land grant is needed to fully identify the extent of the poblacion. So we're going to start the project with a question of whether ranchos and plazas represented architecture from different times or had different functions. And based on survey data at least, the latter appears to be the case. The plazas were most consistently constructed between 1750 and 1850. During periods of conflict, the defensive architecture of the plazas would offer protection for people and livestock, but when raids were infrequent, families would disperse to their ranchos. Plaza architecture doesn't appear to be common until after 1750, corresponding with a period of near constant raids by Navajos, Ute, Apache, and Comanche groups. Overall, there's a pattern of dispersed ranchos in frontier areas located away from the major settlements of Santa Fe, Santa Cruz, Albuquerque, and El Paso. And these are the areas that were occupied by Geniceros and other economically depressed populations. Thank you.
Our next presenter is going to be Dave Phillips.
Okay. This presentation is more of a plea than a report. Okay. So, am I using the arrows wrong here?
You should just be the arrows of the C-spot, just like the left.
Oh, those arrows.
Well, it should, well, either way,
Okay.
that's working.
Most people here know that Chinese material culture appears in New Mexico as soon as the Spanish do. Here you see a porcelain shard, blue on white on one side and red on white on the other. It dates between 1598 and 1610. The complete example in the middle is not archaeological, but shows what the original must have looked like. Such artifacts help tell the story of Spain's global empire, but they don't tell the story of the Chinese people who came here. My concern today is with the Chinese people who began coming here as part of the gold rush of 1849 and have continued arriving ever since. Okay, now I've lost the... As you might expect, the initial wave of immigration was concentrated on the West Coast and in California's gold fields, but within 3 decades, Chinese immigrants could be found across the country, including in New Mexico. This 1885 painting of Albuquerque's Old Town, which looks pretty much the same, doesn't it? Shows one of those immigrants in the lower right corner. The openly racist opposition to Chinese immigrants included federal anti-immigration laws and equally oppressive state and local laws. On a personal note, the original covenants for the house I own, which is 2.5 blocks away that way, state that I'm not allowed to sell my house to anyone of African or Chinese descent. Nevertheless, they persisted. and their descendants live in New Mexico today. My concern is that so far we have not put together a coherent archaeological picture of New Mexico's Chinese immigrant community. Based on studies done in other places, this is not an impossible task. Based on those studies and on the little work that has been done in New Mexico, what will that archaeology look like? So far, I've seen two broad types of remains associated with Chinese immigrants. The first is remains left behind by railroad workers, such as this coin. This camp was found along a railroad leading northwest from El Paso. The report concluded that the camp was created by Chinese railroad workers. One topic for future research is whether Chinese laborers were employed throughout New Mexico or just on certain routes. I'll also mention that there should be some evidence of Chinese laborers at mines, but I haven't seen any reports on those so far. Maybe some of you have. The second type of evidence I've found is urban remains. I don't have a good example from New Mexico, so I'll sneak a few miles across the state line. Like many other places in the country, El Paso once had a Chinatown. Excavations in that Chinatown yielded distinctly Chinese artifacts, such as this bottle for soy sauce, and also rice bowls. So, as the work in El Paso and elsewhere tells us, remains from Chinese immigrants can be found in urban contexts. Now, we should be able to do the same thing right here. Albuquerque's Chinatown was diffuse, as they often were, but here we can see 5 Chinese laundries on one corner in downtown Albuquerque. And of course, the famous association of Chinese with laundries is because given the massive prejudice against Chinese immigrants, they took the low-status jobs. It's not just Albuquerque. Here's a listing of Chinese businesses. They maintain networks among themselves, and they even had their own directory of businesses, and this one shows businesses in 8 different New Mexico towns. Oh, I'll go back for a second because I'm fascinated by this. You'll notice that each of the towns in New Mexico has a Chinese name, and I would love to get translations of those. I wonder what Albuquerque was called, Big Stinking Place or whatever. Okay. Even this recent art in Albuquerque's courthouse district is evidence of New Mexico's Chinese immigrant heritage. I'll leave it to you to learn what the connection is the next time you're in that part of town. The bottom line here is simple. There is such a thing as Chinese immigrant archaeology, but so far we have not done enough of it in New Mexico. And that's all I really wanted to say today, so thank you very much.
Great. We have a few extra minutes if anyone has any questions for our first couple of presenters. Otherwise, we will take a break and come back around 10:15. Maybe.
Because that's why I think the mouse was going here too. I'm going to grab coffee.
it's a good, I think it's a cool collaboration of different things. So.
You're doing contract work?
Yeah.
Where are you at? What are you doing?
Team news.
Okay.
So, mostly just the office. Lots of clients, lots of management.
I was trying to remember when we met you at Mule Creek. That's been, what, 10 years ago?
Yeah, it was a long time
Let's get back over that. That lady who posted us is doing. Well, we were going to gymnastics. They were well, it's a lot of work. Chipping away at it, getting there, but it's a chip. It takes either a lot of personal sacrifice or a lot of money.
Exactly. All of the above.
But it's crazy.
Can't get through here, can we? Go in the other way. Where are you guys? No, too late. So now I'm over here.
There we go.
Oh, no, so no, I don't want to touch the tech. I'm trying to get a couple of changes. Just for fun.
There's a mouse here. It works better.
All right.
Now, does that click forward?
It does.
I can move the slide forward with that?
Yeah, and we should be able to use the arrows as well. I'm not sure
Yeah,
why the
I like
arrows.
the arrows. I like
Okay,
that.
yeah, that should be fine.
I try to keep it going like a video.
Yeah, that should be fine.
Thought of a couple of things.
Yeah, whatever you need to do.
How are you? Thanks for doing all this.
Oh yeah, glad you made it out.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, and I'll say something about this, but it's good on a couple of levels actually. Because a couple of things that I really needed to do that just happened to kind of fit in this window. So by setting this up this way, I mean it's a great opportunity on multiple levels.
Multi-purpose trip.
Yeah, multi-purpose.
Yeah, well, I'm glad it worked out.
Yeah. All right. I'm also gonna. Yeah, that'll be better.
See if those arrows are working or not.
Yep.
Okay, I don't know why they weren't working for Dave.
You never know.
I think I also have PowerPoints and a couple of different versions of PowerPoint.
No, well, that's always a I got the one last night with the corn. I couldn't get it. So, try it. I have a student that's developing a sort of master's thesis on, and I have to know about the second thing. kind of, I don't imagine it's just kind of easy. But like I love it, it's most of it just was too difficult to figure far more productive than just about any other kind of process. So the big one's no longer you see some friends and you're around the hotel, you spend a bunch of money on it. That's okay. I mean, these days we need it, right? But it's still a lot of work. I started going to the essentials before COVID, but then that got knocked out. Way back, right? 20 years ago. And this is great. And that was kind of my introduction to it. It was big, but it wasn't so big. So they went to 2 or 4, maybe 4 or 5 different sessions going on. So it wasn't, exactly. So how do we time this? Is the clock on there?
I think it might have a clock on there, but you kind of.
There it is. There.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Right now, yeah, that's the clock.
So, are we going to go at 10:20?
I think on the agenda we said 10:20.
Yeah.
I also feel like things are gonna. Some people are probably moving on.
Sure. I'll stick to the time whenever you start me. I was thinking it's 10:20 and then go grab a quick bite to eat.
Oh, go for it.
Yeah.
I mean, I told people it's 10:15.